The last thing Ethan ever said to me was, "I'll see you Thursday." He kissed me on the forehead, grabbed his overnight bag, and walked out the door for what was supposed to be a 2-day work trip to Chicago. That was a Tuesday in February. By Thursday, his phone had stopped ringing and started going straight to voicemail. By the following Monday, I was standing in a parking lot outside his family's estate, with no idea that he was 40 minutes away in a room he hadn't chosen in a building I didn't know existed, asking to call me and being told that I had already moved on. 8 months later, I finally learned the truth about where he had been, and who had put him there. My name is Nadia. I was 29 when this started, an event coordinator at a mid-size hotel in downtown Denver, the kind of job that sounds glamorous from the outside, but mostly means 17-hour days and an intimate relationship with spreadsheets and vendor invoices. I had built my life carefully, methodically. I grew up watching my parents scramble after money, after stability, after each other, and I had made a private promise somewhere in my early 20s that I would never be that chaotic. I kept lists. I had savings. I had plans for contingencies I hadn't even encountered yet. Ethan Hargrove was not part of any plan I made. I met him 18 months before he disappeared at a venue walkthrough I was running for a ballroom renovation project. He came in as the consulting architect, blueprints under his arm, this quiet and focused energy that was the complete opposite of every man who had ever tried to get my attention by being loud about it. He wasn't trying to impress me at all. He was just working. I remember standing beside him at the west wall, and without looking up from his notes he said, "This plaster is original, from 1928. Don't let anyone touch it." And I thought, this is a person who understands that some things are worth preserving. We were together 11 months before he proposed. No grand gesture, no flash mob, no restaurant full of people staring at us. He brought takeout to my apartment on a Wednesday, and somewhere between the spring rolls and the second episode of a documentary we'd already seen twice, he said quietly, "I want to do this for the rest of my life. If you do too." I said yes, before he finished the sentence. The ring was his grandmother's, an emerald-cut solitaire slightly asymmetrical in the setting which he apologized for, and I immediately loved. I want to give you some context about the Hargroves because understanding them is understanding everything that happened next. They were old Denver money. Not the visible kind, not the kind that throws galas or names buildings after themselves. The quiet kind. The kind embedded in institutional committees and foundation boards, the kind whose influence operates below the surface of things like root systems. Ethan's father, Roland, had made his money in real estate development and now spent his retirement managing the portfolio in the same controlled, unhurried way. He managed everything else. His mother, Margaret, ran their family charitable foundation and served on 3 or 4 boards I could never fully keep track of. She was a woman who treated every conversation like an audition and every room she walked into like a territory she had already surveyed. Ethan's sister, Claire, was a financial attorney, 43, unmarried. Precise in a way that suggested precision was something she had chosen as a personality rather than simply possessed. She spoke around me rather than to me in most family gatherings. Her questions always sounded like small talk and always felt like assessments. She had, I later came to understand, been running calculations on me from the first moment we met. Ethan knew his family was difficult. He'd been honest about it early on, how he had spent most of his life being the Hargrove who didn't fit the blueprint they had drawn for him. He was supposed to go into finance or law, not architecture. He was supposed to marry within a very specific social geography, someone with the right family name, the right connections, the right understanding of what it meant to be adjacent to that kind of money. Instead, he had built things with his hands and fallen in love with a woman whose parents worked in restaurant management and logistics. He loved his family, but he was clear-eyed about them in a way that I found both reassuring and quietly heartbreaking. We set a tentative wedding date, the second Saturday of October. 14 months away. Long enough to plan thoughtfully, short enough to feel real. We had toured venues, settled on one we both loved, and scheduled the deposit payment for a Thursday. He left for Chicago on Tuesday. The first 24 hours I felt nothing except mild impatience at an unread text. Ethan got absorbed in job sites sometimes. He had a way of going very quiet when he was deep in work, like the professional version of him occupied all available frequency, and everything else had to wait. I texted a low-pressure "How's Chicago" that evening, and assumed he'd reply when he surfaced. By Wednesday afternoon I called. 4 rings voicemail. His outgoing message was that slightly formal recording he'd made 2 years earlier, the one that sounded nothing like how he actually talked, the one I had always found endearing. I left a light message and went back to a seating chart I was fighting with. By Thursday morning the wrongness had settled into my chest, like weather changing. I called again. It didn't even ring. Straight to voicemail. I called his office. His assistant Dana answered, and she went flat in her voice in a way that wasn't impolite exactly, but was very clearly controlled the voice of someone who had been told something and was now managing what she could say about it. She told me Ethan had called in on Wednesday to take personal time. She didn't know how long. She couldn't speak to anything that had happened on the Chicago trip. That pause, that careful flatness. I catalogued it and filed it and returned to it for weeks afterward. I went to his apartment that evening with my key. Everything was exactly as it should have been, his furniture at its usual angles, the particular quality of quiet that belonged to his space. His cat Archie wove around my ankles and yelled at his empty bowl. I fed him. I watered the succulent on the windowsill that Ethan always forgot was alive. I sat on his couch in the dark for a long time and looked at the room. His overnight bag was not there, meaning he still had it, or someone had collected it. My friend Jess told me to wait through the weekend before escalating. People disappeared into personal crises sometimes, she said. Family emergencies happened. I should give him space to surface on his own. I did not feel like waiting through the weekend, but I did it anyway because she was usually right about these things. I heard nothing. On Monday morning I called Margaret Hargrove. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was exactly as composed as it always was, the particular tone she used that communicated both warmth and a ceiling on how far you were welcome to go. She told me Ethan was fine. When I asked to speak with him, she said he was resting and that the family was around him during a difficult period. When I asked what kind of difficult period, she said she thought it was best if he had some space right now. When I asked where he was, she said she didn't think that would be helpful at the moment. Then she said she hoped I was doing well and ended the call. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone and felt something very cold and very precise move through me. She knew where he was. She was providing nothing. And the phrase "when he was ready," deployed twice in 3 minutes of conversation, carried in it the clear implication that his readiness was something she would be determining. The weeks that followed were some of the most corrosive of my life. Not grief. Grief would have been cleaner, would have had a shape I could navigate. This was uncertainty, and uncertainty is its own particular kind of damage. I didn't know if Ethan was physically hurt. I didn't know if he had chosen to leave and was using his family as a buffer. I didn't know if something had happened in Chicago that had broken something I didn't have language for yet. Every possible explanation I could construct had a hole in it that the others didn't, and so I moved between them in a cycle that made sleep very difficult. I hired a private investigator in the 3rd week. Not comfortably, it cost me nearly everything I had in my discretionary savings, but I needed to know he was alive. The PI's name was Marcus, a dry, methodical man who communicated in short emails and did not offer opinions unless asked. He traced Ethan's credit card activity and found it had gone dark after a single charge on the Wednesday following his departure, a gas station in Colorado Springs 32 miles from the Hargrove estate. Nothing after that. Not a single transaction in 3 months of monitoring. Claire called me in the 3rd week. Her voice had that imported warmth assembled for the call set down again when it was over. She said Ethan was dealing with personal health challenges, that the family was present for him, that they hoped I could understand the need for privacy. When I said directly that I was his fiancé and I had a right to know what was happening, she said she understood my frustration, and then there was a long pause, and then she said, "Nadia, I think you should prepare yourself for the possibility that things may not go the way you hoped." She hung up. I kept wearing the ring. I don't know why entirely. Some combination of stubbornness and the inability to perform a certainty I didn't feel. I wore it every day, and I told people what I knew, which was almost nothing, and I waited. If you've ever been on the wrong side of information, when someone else has all the pieces and you have none, and you can feel the shape of what's being kept from you, but can't see it clearly, you know the particular helplessness of those months. If this kind of story speaks to you, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more to come, and this story is just getting started. Marcus found something 2 months in. A small crack in the silence. He had been running Ethan's professional records, filings, licensing updates, public documentation. What he found was a power of attorney document filed with the state approximately 3 weeks after Ethan vanished. It was a broad document granting Claire Hargrove legal authority over Ethan's financial and medical decisions. It was dated the Friday following his disappearance, 4 days after he left for Chicago. A broad POA1 covering both finances and medical requires either a notarized signature from the grantor or medical documentation of incapacitation, sufficient to justify the transfer of authority. 4 days. Someone had declared Ethan incapacitated within 4 days. I met Dana for coffee on a Saturday near her apartment. She had agreed too quickly when I reached out, which told me she had been waiting for the right way to talk to someone. She wouldn't tell me where Ethan was. But she told me this the day after he left for Chicago. A man identifying himself as a family representative had called his office. He had formally notified Ethan's employer that Ethan was commencing a medical leave of indefinite length. His projects had been quietly redistributed within the week. His email had been forwarded to a colleague. No further information had been provided. He hadn't stepped away. He had been stepped away by someone else. While his projects were already being redistributed, I went back to Marcus and told him about the POA and asked him to dig deeper into the Hargrove financials, specifically anything connected to Claire's professional filings. He said he'd see what was accessible through public record, and then I waited again, for another 4 months. Getting up every morning and going to work and arranging flowers and seating charts and making small talk with vendors and coming home in the evenings to a cat that wasn't mine and an apartment that felt like a waiting room. The text arrived on a Thursday in October, 8 months after Ethan had kissed my forehead and walked out the door. Unknown number. Short message carefully worded. If you are Nadia Chen, I have information about Ethan Hargrove. I can only communicate by message. Please confirm if this is you. I stared at it long enough for the screen to dim. My first thought was scam. My second thought was no scammer would know both our full names and reach out from an unknown number asking me to confirm my identity rather than offering me anything. I replied. The person said her name was Priya. She identified herself as a staff member at a private residential facility outside Denver. She said she had access to Ethan's intake file. She said my name and number were still listed as his emergency contact. She had been watching his situation for months and was no longer comfortable with what she was observing. She said Ethan was at her facility. He had been there since February. I sat down on my kitchen floor. Not dramatically my legs, just decided they were finished standing for a moment. I typed back with hands that were having trouble with the keypad. Priya told me what she could without ending her employment. Ethan had been brought in by his family in February. He had arrived in the middle of a genuine acute anxiety episode. She wanted to be precise about that. He had been overwhelmed and disoriented, and in a state that had required intervention. The initial care had been appropriate. What happened after that was different. He had been placed on a combination of medications. He had been in a communication, restricted environment, family-only contact. His phone had been confiscated on arrival. She had seen in the notes that I was listed as his emergency contact, and that the family had flagged me as someone whose contact would be detrimental to his recovery. He had not been permitted to reach me, he had asked. Multiple times. The requests had been denied. Would you have believed it the first time you heard it? I'm not sure I did completely in those first few hours. Part of me was already on the floor. Part of me was still running the calculation, still looking for the version of this story that made sense in the way I had been trained to expect things to make sense. I need you to understand what I'm about to tell you, because it took me some time to hold it in one piece. Ethan had not been involuntarily committed through a court process. No judge, no formal hearing, no legal finding of danger. He had gone to his parents' house during the Chicago trip not as a layover, but because he'd had a panic attack, severe enough that he had driven there instead of catching his flight. He was overwhelmed. He needed help. His parents had called a private facility. They had signed voluntary admission papers under a temporary emergency authorization, a mechanism that required a physician's sign-off and a family member's assertion that the patient lacked the capacity to make informed decisions in that moment. Ethan, in the middle of a genuine crisis, had not had the coherence to refuse. And then his family had made sure he stayed. They had managed his medication carefully. They had controlled every piece of information that entered his room and every piece of communication that left it. They had told him I had been informed of his situation and had chosen to give him space. They had implied Priya believed that I had agreed the distance was healthy. They had told him at least once that I had returned the ring. I was wearing the ring. I had worn it every day for 8 months. They had used a real crisis as the entrance, and then locked the door from outside. And the facility, privately funded, privately staffed, selected by the family, had given them the tools to do it. What Priya said next, I have returned to more times than I can count. She said that by any clinical measure Ethan was well enough to leave. He had been stable for months, his anxiety was managed, his cognition was clear, he had been filing written requests to be discharged. He had been asking in writing to contact me. The requests were going to a treatment team that his family funded and his family had selected. He was not being held by the state, he was being held by money. I did not fall apart. I want to be clear about this, because I think it matters. I have heard the version of this kind of story, where the woman collapses and waits for someone else to fix it, and that is not what happened. What happened was that I went very cold and very focused, in a way I had never accessed before, and every organizational instinct I had ever developed redirected itself toward a single point: getting Ethan out. I called an attorney's office that evening and left a message. The next morning I sat across from a civil rights attorney named David Rowe, who specialized in psychiatric holds, patient rights, and cases involving family-authorized confinement. He was quiet and careful, and his office smelled like old coffee and case files, and I sat across from him and laid out everything I had. Marcus's records, the POA filing, Dana's account, Priya's text exchange, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "This was not impossible to fight. It would cost money I didn't have. It would be ugly. But it was not impossible. We filed for an independent medical review, which was a legitimate legal mechanism that forced the facility to respond to an external clinical evaluation of whether Ethan's continued retention was medically justified. This was slow. It was bureaucratic. It required the facility to cooperate with a process they had not been designed to welcome. But it was real, and it moved. And while it moved, Marcus kept working. What he found about Claire restructured everything I thought I understood about why this had happened. In the 8 months Ethan had been in that facility, months during which Claire held his power of attorney, his personal savings and a small trust he had inherited from his grandfather had been actively used, not maintained. Used. A series of transfers, each structured to stay beneath standard compliance flagging thresholds, had moved funds from those accounts into a private holding company. 3 layers of registration separated that company from Claire's name, but Marcus was methodical. The total across 8 months of transfers was over $400,000. The holding company had been registered 4 months before Ethan disappeared. This had never been about protecting him. It had always been about the money. About what was in his estate, about what would have changed if he had married me, a woman they had never approved of, and begun making financial decisions as a husband rather than a son. A panic attack had been the door they needed, and they had been ready to walk through it before he ever had one. The love, the care, the protection, it was accounting. It had always been accounting. The independent review came back in Ethan's favor. The external physician found him clinically stable and noted that his continued retention appeared disproportionate to his clinical presentation. The facility, facing regulatory scrutiny it had not anticipated, began discharge procedures. I was in that parking lot on a gray November morning, 11 days before the 1-year anniversary of the Tuesday he had walked out my door. My attorney was beside me. Jess was in my car with the engine running. And the Hargroves were there too, because of course they were. Margaret and Roland and Claire standing near the entrance, composed in the way of people who have always believed that composure is the same as being right. Claire saw me first. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly. Recalculation. Margaret walked toward me. Her expression was the one I had seen at every family dinner: pleasant, contained, fractionally elevated, like she was looking at something she had already assessed and filed. I said, "You told him I gave back the ring," she said. "We were trying to help him recover." I said, "From what?" "From me." Roland started to say something. David raised one hand slightly, and Roland stopped. He stopped. That one small gesture told me everything about the power differential I had been operating inside for a year without fully naming it. Claire said, and I remember this exactly, the cadence and the precision of it. "You have to understand that our family has always done what was necessary to protect Ethan." I said, "You moved $400,000 out of his accounts while he was sedated in a private room. Tell me how that's protecting him." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones before it. He came out of the building about 15 minutes later, thinner than I remembered, moving more carefully, blinking in the November light like someone readjusting to a world that had shifted while he was away from it. He stopped when he saw me. We stood 30 feet apart and looked at each other for a moment that felt completely outside of ordinary time. Then he said, "They told me you gave back the ring." I held up my left hand. The asymmetrical setting. The slightly warm gold. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down on the curb right there in the parking lot and put his face in his hands. I sat down next to him. We didn't say anything for a while. The first real conversation we had was nothing like the reunion I had constructed in my imagination over 8 months of waiting. It was halting and full of silences, and weighted down with things that neither of us knew yet how to carry together. He had believed for months that I had walked away. Every piece of information that had reached him had been filtered through people who had a reason to make him believe I was gone. When he had pushed back, when he had asked to reach me, they had framed his need to contact me as a symptom of the thing he was recovering from. He had been medicated into a state where his own certainty about what was real had become unreliable. That is what a controlled environment does over enough time to even the most grounded people. You start to hear something, and then you hear it again, and eventually the voice repeating it starts to sound like your own. "I started to believe it," he said, sitting on that curb. "I kept pushing back and they kept responding, and eventually the pushing back started to feel like the problem. Like maybe my wanting to call you was proof that I wasn't well yet." I know that sounds, I told him it didn't sound like anything except what it was. Which was someone who had been lied to systematically by people with resources and a plan. The legal consequences moved the way legal consequences do, slowly, and sometimes infuriatingly, but they moved. Claire's financial transfers formed the core of a civil fraud case Ethan filed with David's firm. The amounts were too large, the timing too exact, the connection to the holding company too deliberate to be explained away. Her attorneys made several settlement approaches. Ethan declined all of them. The case went to civil court and settled 18 months later in Ethan's favor. The funds were returned in full, plus interest, plus legal costs. Claire's license faced a separate review by the state bar. That process is still ongoing. The facility was reviewed by the state's health department. Several of their practices around family-authorized admissions, communication restrictions, and the role of privately funded treatment teams in discharge decisions were flagged as needing revision. They did not lose their license, but the review was public record. Margaret and Roland faced no charges. That was the part that required the most work to accept. What they had done had existed in the space between law and cruelty, made possible by money access and the kind of influence that moves through private channels rather than public ones. Margaret called me once nearly a year after Ethan was discharged. She said she had done what any mother would do for her son. I let it go to voicemail, and I never returned it. If you're still with this story, I want you to know that the ending is not a neat bow. Real life rarely provides those. What I can tell you is that it's better than it might have been. Stay with me. If you found value in this channel, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely matters, and it helps more people find stories like this one. Ethan and I did not simply pick up where we left off. I think any version of this story that pretends otherwise would be doing a disservice to what actually happened. What we had before was real and it was good. But what happened in the space between had changed things, not broken them, but changed them the way a bone that's healed is not the same bone it was before. We went slowly. We talked about everything, including the things that were uncomfortable, the things where there was no clean answer. We saw a therapist separately, and then together. We learned again, and with intention, how to be in the same room without the weight of that year, pressing on every corner of it. We did not cancel the venue. We had to change the date, of course. October had long since passed. We rescheduled for the following May. The ring fit the same way it always had. There are things I know now that I didn't know before any of this. I know that some families confuse control with love so completely and over such a long period of time that the distinction becomes genuinely inaccessible to them. I know that money is one of the most effective instruments of confinement ever invented precisely because it operates invisibly and because the people who use it most aggressively have the most practice, making it look like something else. I know that a mental health crisis is not a character flaw, and it is not an opportunity, and it is not something that should ever be weaponized by the people who claim to love you. I know that a man I loved had a panic attack in a car in February, and that the people who were supposed to take care of him used that moment as the door they had already decided to walk through. And I know that he sat in a room for 8 months asking to call me, and was told every time he asked that I had already gone. That is what it looks like when love is used as an instrument, when concern becomes a cover story. When a family decides that their preferences are simply more important than another person's freedom. I still have Priya's first text saved on my phone. I have never deleted it. It says, "If you are Nadia Chen, I have information about Ethan Hargrove. I can only communicate by message. Please confirm if this is you." I think about what would have happened if she had decided it wasn't her place, if Dana hadn't agreed to coffee, if the power of attorney had been filed through a private mechanism instead of public record, if any single thread in that chain had not held. Some of those thoughts I try not to follow too far. They don't lead anywhere useful. What I try to hold on to instead is this: when the wrong people have all the power, sometimes one person with access to the right information changes everything. Priya had access. She chose to use it. In the middle of a situation designed to make Ethan invisible and make me look like I had chosen not to see him, she sent a text from an unknown number and handed me the thread I needed to pull. I think about her every time someone tells me that speaking up isn't their place. The people who love you should make you feel more free, not less. If the relationship you're in with a partner, with a family, with anyone, makes you feel smaller, more controlled, more dependent, less able to reach the people you love freely, that is information worth paying attention to. It was always information worth paying attention to. We just couldn't see it clearly until the machinery became too visible to explain away. And sometimes the most important thing in the world is a stranger who decides that what's happening in front of them is not something they can stay quiet about. I'm grateful every day that she wasn't quiet,